The ticking of the mantel clock was the only sound in the room when I caught my own son, slipping my property papers into his coat. Still, I set them back on the table, letting each tick cool the fire rising in my chest. As the clock grew louder, its steady rhythm felt like judgment on the father I tried to be. While I watched him avoid my eyes, that same ticking exposed every quiet warning I'd ignored. The same rhythm revealed his betrayal wasn't a mistake, it was intention. That's when I decided, if my son wanted my legacy early, he'd inherit nothing but my resolve. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Frank Dawson moved slowly around his lakeside cabin, the kind of steady, deliberate movement that came from a lifetime of building things with his hands. The December light slanted through the frosted windows, soft enough to make the dust motes shimmer, bright enough to turn the room into a warm pocket of gold against the cold Minnesota morning. He stood on a small wooden stool, one he'd carved back in '82, and hung a tiny bird-shaped ornament on the tree. Every piece on those branches meant something. Some carved, some painted, some stitched, each one touched by the hands of a family that felt so much closer back when his wife, Margaret, was still alive. He took a slow breath. Holidays always pulled her closer and farther away at the same time. Frank stepped into the kitchen, where the smell of nutmeg and cinnamon already floated from the vintage recipe cards he kept in a tin box with Margaret's handwriting on the lid. He laid out butter, sugar, flour, cranberries, the familiar choreography of making her Christmas loaf. As he mixed the batter, he hummed the tune she used to sway to while cooking, off-key but steady. The tune filled the empty space where her laughter used to live. When the loaf went in the oven, he wiped his hands on a faded red towel and reached for his phone. He typed the same message he sent every year. "What time will you all be arriving tomorrow? Need to know when to start the ham." He reread it once, then hit send. A few minutes passed, nothing. He told himself they were busy, holiday busy, parenting busy, life busy. He tried not to let the silence sting. Frank moved to the living room, sat down by the fireplace and began wrapping gifts. His fingers, still strong but slower now, folded paper over a box containing a science kit for Alex, his grandson. For Melissa's youngest, he'd bought a little knit cap with a snowflake pattern Margaret once loved. For Charlie and Rebecca's twins, books, warm gloves, chocolate tucked into the corners of each package like a secret. He wrapped each one with real care, smoothing the tape as if affection could be pressed into paper. He hesitated before writing the tags. "Love, Grandpa." Every year, he hoped the kids could still feel the weight of that word. Halfway through tying a bow, his phone buzzed. He reached for it quickly, hope first, logic second, but it wasn't the group chat. It was Alex. "Hey Grandpa, can I come early? Like tomorrow morning early. I want to help with the lights." Frank felt warmth rise in his chest. Out of everyone, Alex was the one who still came because he wanted to, not out of holiday obligation. He typed back, "Of course, buddy, doors open. I'll have Coco waiting." He lingered on the message longer than he needed to. It felt like a small anchor thrown into a sea where everyone else seemed to drift farther away each year. Outside, snow had started to fall. Big, slow, cinematic flakes that made the whole lake seem to hush and listen. The cabin lights glowed through the windows like a postcard, one of those perfect northern Christmas scenes people paid money to recreate for a weekend. To Frank, though, it wasn't a postcard. It was home. The place where he and Margaret built their whole life. The place where every Christmas morning for 30 years had been loud and messy and perfect. He went to the window and watched the snow drift down, thickening on the porch railings he'd sanded just last spring. Everything looked ready. The food, the tree, the gifts, the house, and him. He was ready too, more than he'd admit out loud, for the noise, the warmth, the voices of his children filling up the hallways again. He pictured how tomorrow would look. Charlie carrying the ham to the kitchen, Melissa brushing snow off her coat, the grandkids rushing inside with mittened hands, everybody complaining about the cold before settling into the comfort of tradition. It was a picture he held onto tightly, because it was one of the last pieces of Margaret he could still touch. He turned back toward the living room when his phone buzzed again. A second vibration followed immediately. Then a third. Frank wiped his hands on his jeans, walked over to the coffee table and picked up the phone. The screen lit up with a notification from the family group chat, the one that had been silent all month. His heart lifted, expecting arrival times, maybe excitement, maybe even gratitude. Instead, he stared at the screen as the message appeared. And in that brief second, before he even opened it, something in the air shifted, subtle but cold, as if the winter outside had crept a little too close to the inside. Frank tapped the message. What he saw wiped the warmth from the room before he could even take his next breath. The Christmas he had waited all year for was about to change in a way he never saw coming. Frank stared at the family group chat message like it was written in a language he didn't recognize. The alert tone was still echoing faintly in the quiet cabin when the words finally settled into meaning. Melissa had written, "Dad, we're doing Christmas at Charlie's this year." He blinked, waiting for some clarification, a follow-up message that explained it was temporary or a misunderstanding or maybe just a suggestion. But the typing bubbles disappeared, replaced instead by a new message, this time from his son. "It's easier for everyone, Charlie." Easier. Frank let that word sink in. He'd spent the last 2 weeks preparing everything, cleaning the guest rooms, shoveling the walkway, buying everyone's favorite food. Margaret used to say he treated Christmas like a sacred craft project. Easier. That word hollowed something inside him. Before he could react, another message arrived, sharp and polished like the woman who wrote it. "Your cabin is too small, too cold, Rebecca." Frank exhaled slowly, a long breath that trembled on its way out. Too small, too cold. Funny, none of them seemed to think so when they were kids running barefoot across the old wood floors, or when they used to beg him to build snow forts outside and warm up with hot cocoa by the fire. Back then, the cabin wasn't too anything. It was home. He sank down onto the edge of his armchair, fingers gripping the armrest as if bracing for impact. The oven ticked in the background, cooling from the batch of cookies he'd just baked. Gifts were wrapped. Lights were strung. Everything was ready except, suddenly, the people he'd done it all for. Frank's thumb hovered over the phone screen, then he pressed the call button beside Melissa's name. The ringing tone cut through the silence, once, twice, 3 times. Then it stopped abruptly. "Call declined." He swallowed, tried Charlie next. Declined again. His jaw tightened, not in anger, but in a kind of tired hurt that went deeper than disappointment. It felt like being quietly erased from his own holiday. A moment later, his phone buzzed again. But this time, it wasn't the group chat. It was Alex. "I'm sorry, Grandpa, I didn't know." Just that, simple, honest. The text of someone who still cared enough to feel guilty about a choice he didn't even make. Frank's shoulders softened for the first time since the messages arrived. He typed back a reassuring lie. "It's okay, buddy." But even as he sent it, he knew this wasn't okay, not even close. He looked around the room as if seeing it through his children's eyes. The cabin was old, yes. The furniture was worn from years of use. The decor was traditional, Margaret's quilts, wooden shelves, hand-carved figurines. Nothing about it was sleek or modern. It had character, warmth, history. Maybe that was the problem. Frank set the phone down on the coffee table, then leaned back and let his hands rest on his knees. His mind drifted back to years when Christmas here meant something. When the house overflowed with noise, when Margaret's laughter bounced off the walls, when the kids believed the magic of the season lived inside these walls. Now his own children saw the cabin as an inconvenience, a place not worth their time. Too small, too cold words that felt less like descriptions and more like excuses. The silence in the room seemed to deepen. Outside, the snow was still falling steadily, coating the world in white, making everything look new and untouched. But inside him, something old was cracking, something he'd held together for years through tradition and hope. He reached for the phone again, not to call this time, but to reread the messages. Each one cut a little differently. Melissa's apologetic tone disguised as practicality, Charlie's casual dismissal, Rebecca's blunt criticism. Together, they formed a chorus he couldn't ignore. For a moment, he wondered what Margaret would say if she were here. Probably something gentle but wise, something that reminded him not to let other people define the value of what he loved. She had always been the bridge between him and the children. Without her, the distance had grown, slowly but unmistakably. Frank's voice was barely above a whisper as he murmured to the empty room, "I guess Christmas changed." The words lingered in the air, fragile but honest. He felt the truth of them, the weight of holidays that weren't what they used to be, the slow erosion of traditions he'd spent decades building. But so have I. He didn't know exactly what that meant yet, but he felt it settle inside him with a quiet, steady certainty. Something was shifting, something he couldn't name, but it was there, waiting. The phone sat on the table, the group chat still open, the messages glowing like cold neon against the warm room. The cursor blinked at the bottom of the screen, waiting for his reply. Frank didn't type anything back. Not yet. Because for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure he would reply at all. Christmas morning should have sounded like life, footsteps, voices, clattering dishes, the kind of familiar chaos that made the old cabin feel young again. But instead, Frank stepped into the kitchen and faced a table set for people who weren't coming. The ham he'd glazed the night before sat untouched, the cranberry loaf still wrapped in the towel he'd folded so carefully. Steam no longer rose from the cider pot. The room felt suspended in time, as if every preparation had been frozen by the decision his children made. He stood there longer than he meant to, staring at the plates lined up like unanswered invitations. The cabin had never felt this big, this hollow. Even the walls seemed to echo differently without the weight of family voices bouncing between them. He moved slowly to his chair and sat down, the wooden frame creaking in the silence. For a moment, he didn't even pick up his fork. He just looked at the empty seats across from him and let the loneliness land where it wanted. Eventually, he cut into the ham and took a small bite. It tasted exactly the way it always did, sweet, warm, comforting. But without anyone to share it with, the flavor fell flat. It felt like eating memory instead of food. Outside, faint pops of fireworks drifted from the lakeshore, followed by muffled laughter from neighbors celebrating with their own families. The sounds were close enough to remind him of what he was missing, far enough to make him feel like he didn't belong to that world anymore. He reached for his phone, hoping for a simple "Merry Christmas, Dad." Something, anything. But instead, the screen lit up with notifications from social media, posts from his children. There was Melissa, smiling in a living room draped in gold and white decorations, her kids wearing matching holiday pajamas. Then another photo, this time from Charlie and Rebecca. A long banquet table set with crystal glasses, expensive centerpieces, and a caption bragging about "our first modern Christmas hosted beautifully." Frank stared at those images, his thumb hovering over the screen. He didn't feel anger exactly, not yet. What he felt was something quieter, heavier, a kind of slow sinking in his chest, as if he were watching himself disappear from their lives in real time. They weren't missing him. They weren't even thinking of him. They had moved on to a different version of the holiday, one that didn't include old wood stoves or hand-carved ornaments or the smell of Margaret's recipes filling the cabin. He set the phone face down on the table. The silence grew again, swallowing whatever pieces of pride he had left. He finished his meal because the alternative was leaving the food untouched, and something in him refused to give them that level of power over his day. When he finally stood, The chair scraped the floor in a way that sounded almost accusatory. The afternoon passed slowly, dimly. He walked room to room, adjusting decorations that no one would see, checking the fire that didn't need tending, picking up a stray ribbon he'd dropped while wrapping gifts. Each little task felt like a reminder of how much he had hoped for this day, and how easily that hope had been dismissed. As dusk settled, the phone rang. The sound startled him in the quiet. He checked the caller ID and felt a small, unexpected warmth. Pastor Judy. He cleared his throat before answering, not wanting the loneliness in his voice to give him away. "Frank," she said gently, "I've been thinking about you today." That single sentence cracked something open in him. He didn't reply right away. He didn't trust what might come out if he spoke too quickly. "I wasn't sure if you had company," she continued, "but something in my heart told me you might be spending the day alone." Frank swallowed. "You're not wrong," he admitted softly. There was no pity in her silence, only care, the kind that didn't make a man feel smaller for accepting it. "We're having a Christmas dinner at the church tonight," she said. "Nothing fancy, just good food and good people. I'd love for you to join us." He felt himself almost refusing, not because he didn't want to go, but because agreeing meant acknowledging how empty his own house was. But Pastor Judy had always known how to reach him without pressing too hard. He looked again at the silent rooms around him, at the table cleared of a meal eaten alone, at the tree that glowed softly with ornaments made for a family that no longer showed up. "Hey," forced a small, polite smile, even though no one could see it, and said, "Yes, Pastor, I'd like that." His voice was steady, but his heart was, because even as he agreed, he knew it didn't change the truth of the day. He wasn't spending Christmas with his family. And somewhere deep inside, a new kind of cold was beginning to settle, one that had nothing to do with the Minnesota winter. Snow still clung to the cabin's porch steps 2 days after Christmas, packed into soft ridges where no one had walked except Frank. He was sweeping them absent-mindedly when he heard the crunch of boots on the path, a lighter, quicker rhythm than an adult's. He looked up to see Alex making his way toward him, cheeks pink from the cold, a paper envelope held carefully in both hands. "Grandpa," Alex called out, breath turning to vapor in front of him. Frank felt warmth move through the cold ache that had settled in his chest the last few days. "Hey, buddy," he said, lowering the broom. "Didn't know you were coming by." Alex shrugged in that modest, teenage way. "Mom had errands. I told her I wanted to stop here." He held out the envelope. "I made you something." Frank took it gently as if it were fragile. The card was clearly handmade, construction paper folded unevenly, a drawing of the cabin sketched in pencil on the front. Inside, in Alex's careful handwriting, it read, "Christmas isn't the same without your house." Below it, "Love you, Grandpa." Those words landed deeper than Alex probably realized. Frank cleared his throat. "This means a lot, kiddo." Alex smiled, shifting awkwardly. "I'm sorry we didn't come on Christmas. I didn't know until the day before." Frank nodded. "It's all right. I figured that part wasn't your decision." They went inside, shaking off the cold. The fire was still low in the hearth from earlier, and Frank stirred it a little, letting the warmth build. Alex sat on the couch, glancing around the room at the decorations still hanging, untouched since Frank had put them up. Garlands he'd woven himself, the tree still lit, the plates still neatly stacked by the counter. "It looks really nice in here," Alex said softly, "like Christmas is supposed to look." Frank gave a small, tired smile. "I thought so too." For a moment they sat in easy silence, the kind that only exists between two people who don't need to pretend. Then Alex spoke again, casually, as if repeating something he thought was harmless. "Dad and Rebecca were saying the cabin will be ours soon anyway." Frank's hand paused mid-motion over the fire poker. Alex kept talking, not yet realizing the earthquake of meaning behind his words. "Rebecca was telling Mom that once you know, Once you're older and stuff, they'll have to take over everything. She said it just makes sense since you don't really use the place like normal people. The words hit Frank with a coldness that felt sharper than any winter wind. He straightened slowly, the fire's warmth no longer reaching him. "What did Rebecca say exactly?" he asked, voice steady but thinner than before. Alex blinked, replaying the moment in his mind. She said, "Frank will leave the cabin to us soon anyway," like it was just expected. He hesitated now, eyes widening with realization. "Oh, Grandpa, I probably shouldn't have said that, should I?" Frank stared at the logs burning in front of him, their edges curling and darkening. Everything suddenly aligned. The abrupt cancellation, the eagerness to host Christmas at Charlie's house, the hurried criticisms about the cabin being too small, too cold. They hadn't been avoiding inconvenience. They'd been circling his house like future owners. Alex stood up quickly, worry flooding his face. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make you upset. I didn't realize." Frank turned to him and placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "You didn't do anything wrong, Alex. You told me the truth. I'm glad you did. But they probably didn't want you to know." "That," Frank said quietly, "is exactly why I needed to hear it." Alex lowered his gaze. "They shouldn't talk like that. It's your home. You built it." Frank looked around the cabin, not the decorations or the food or the gifts, but the beams he'd set with his own hands, the windows he'd framed with Margaret at his side, the hearth they'd spent decades sitting beside. This place wasn't an asset. It was a life. His life. And now he understood something he'd been trying not to see. His children cared about the cabin more than they cared about the man who lived in it. To them, he wasn't burdensome, unless he stood between them and what they assumed would one day be theirs. He squeezed Alex's shoulder gently. "Thank you for telling me, really." Alex nodded, still uneasy. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." "You didn't," Frank repeated, "but your father and Rebecca, they might have." When Alex left a little while later, Frank walked slowly back inside, closing the door behind him with a soft click. He stood in the middle of the room, listening to the familiar creaks of the cabin settling in the evening cold. He wasn't angry, not yet. What he felt was something deeper, more resolute. A line had been drawn and he hadn't drawn it. But he could draw the next one. He looked around the home he'd built and whispered into the quiet, "They won't get this place by entitlement." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise, one he intended to keep. Frank didn't drive to Charlie's house in anger. He drove in hope, fragile, cautious hope that maybe the holiday tension could still be cleared, that maybe his children hadn't meant to cut him out, that maybe Alex's revelation had been a misunderstanding shaped by teenage ears. The road to Charlie's suburban neighborhood was layered with fresh snow, the kind that muffled every sound and made the world feel deceptively peaceful. Frank rehearsed what he planned to say, that he'd felt hurt, that communication mattered, that families should talk things through. Nothing dramatic, nothing accusing, just the truth. He parked in front of the Dawson home, a large modern place with tall windows glowing warmly from within. It looked inviting, a place where family should have belonged. Frank stood on the walkway for a moment, steadying himself before reaching for the doorbell. But as he lifted his hand, faint voices reached him from inside, close enough to hear through the half-open kitchen window. He didn't intend to listen, but then he heard his name. "After New Year," Rebecca said, her voice crisp and confident. "We need Dad to sign over the cabin before his memory fades." Frank froze. The snowflakes on his coat didn't melt, they seemed to burn. Inside, he heard a rustle, then Melissa's hesitant voice. "I don't know, Rebecca, he's still sharp, he's not slipping." "Everyone thinks they're fine before they decline," Rebecca replied, almost impatient. "We have to move while he's agreeable. It's the responsible thing." Frank felt his stomach drop. Agreeable. That's what he was to her, a signature waiting to happen. Through the window, he could see them gathered in the kitchen. Melissa stood with her arms folded, eyes lowered. She looked troubled, like a woman torn between loyalty and convenience. And then Charlie stepped into view, leaning against the counter with a weary sigh. "If he refuses," Charlie said, rubbing the bridge of his nose, "we'll move him to assisted living. He won't fight it. He hates conflict." The words hit Frank with the force of a physical blow. Assisted living. Discussed casually. Without him. As if his autonomy were just another item on their to-do list. He stepped back instinctively, boots crunching softly in the snow. No one inside noticed. They kept talking, planning, rationalizing, deciding what would happen to him as if he were a problem to be managed. His heart hammered against his ribs, each beat echoing with disbelief. He'd come here to have an honest conversation with his son, maybe even to mend fences. Instead, he was hearing the truth of what they wanted, not reconciliation, not understanding. Control. The cabin. His future. He swallowed hard, tasting a bitterness he'd never felt toward his own children. His breath fogged in the cold air as he forced himself to stay quiet. There was nothing for him inside that house now, not the conversation he'd planned, not the respect he deserved. Slowly, silently, he stepped off the porch and walked back toward his truck. His hands shook as he opened the door, not from the cold, but from the shock settling deep in his bones. He sat behind the wheel without starting the engine, gripping it tightly as if the truck were the only solid thing left in his life. For a long moment he didn't move. His eyes blurred with tears he didn't bother to blink away. He felt foolish for expecting better. He felt betrayed in a way he hadn't imagined possible. But beneath the grief, something else was rising, something steady and unfamiliar. A resolve. His children weren't worried about his memory fading. They were worried about missing their chance to claim the cabin before he could think for himself. They saw his aging as an opportunity, not a vulnerability. They were planning his life for him, and worse, deciding what part of it they could take. Frank wiped his eyes roughly with the back of his hand, then inhaled a long, shaking breath. He could fall apart right here, right now, or he could choose something else. He started the engine. The headlights washed over the road in a bright, determined arc. As he drove away from Charlie's house, the tears kept coming, but they were different now, not helpless, not broken. They were the kind that cleared the fog from a man's mind, revealing a truth too sharp to ignore. He wasn't losing control of his life. But if he didn't act soon, his children would take it from him. By the time he reached the quiet turnoff leading back to his cabin, his grief had settled into something firmer, colder, and far more dangerous to Ennio. Ni who thought they could manipulate him. He whispered into the empty cab, "They don't get to decide my future." The promise settled into him like steel. And with that, Frank Dawson drove home, not defeated, but awakening to a fight he never thought he'd have to face. Frank didn't sleep the night after overhearing his children. He lay in bed staring at the faint outline of the ceiling beams, listening to the cabin settle in the cold, each creak sounding like a question he didn't want to answer. By morning his eyes burned and his chest felt tight, not from age but from the weight of a truth he couldn't unhear. His own family had planned his future without him, not out of love, not out of concern, but out of convenience and entitlement. By 8 a.m., he already had his coat on, keys in hand. The roads were slick with fresh frost, pale sunlight stretching across the frozen lake as he drove. He hadn't called ahead. He didn't need to. Harold Kent had been his attorney and friend for nearly 30 years. The man always made room when Frank needed him. The bell above the law office door jingled softly as he stepped inside. The warmth hit him instantly, followed by the faint scent of old books and cedar polish. Harold looked up from behind his desk, glasses slipping slightly down his nose. "Well," Harold said, eyebrows lifting, "you're here early, everything all right?" Frank closed the door carefully, as if any loud sound might break something already fragile inside him. He took a seat opposite Harold, placing his gloves on the desk with slow, trembling hands. "I need to talk," Frank said. His voice almost gave out on the last word. Harold leaned forward. "What happened?" Frank inhaled shakily. Then he told him, all of it, the canceled Christmas, the sudden shift to celebrating at Charlie's house, the comments about the cabin, Alex's innocent admission, and finally the conversation he'd overheard, the one that replayed in his mind like a cold, steady drumbeat. Charlie talking about assisted living. Rebecca pushing for signatures before his memory fades. Melissa nodding, not resisting. As he spoke, Frank's voice wavered, caught between shame and heartbreak. He wasn't a man who cried easily, but the betrayal had settled so deeply that his words broke under the weight. When he finished, Harold let the silence sit just long enough for Frank to breathe. Then Harold said, calm and unwavering, "Frank, then it's time to protect what's yours." Frank looked up, eyes reddened. "I shouldn't have to protect myself from my own children." "No, you shouldn't," Harold agreed gently. "But sometimes we don't get the children we deserved. We get the ones we raised in the world we couldn't control, and some of them lose their way." Frank swallowed hard. "I raised them better than this." Harold nodded, eyes softening. "You did, but greed has a way of convincing people they're entitled to things they didn't earn." He reached for a folder on his desk. "The cabin is your legacy, not a bargaining chip for your care." Frank looked down at his hands, rough from years of carpentry. He'd built that cabin piece by piece. Every beam, every board. Margaret had chosen the curtains, the dishes, the quilts. Now his own children wanted to strip it from him like they were owed the life he and his wife had created. "What do we do?" Frank asked quietly. Harold opened the folder. "We make a new estate plan, one that reflects your values, not theirs." He outlined it clearly, without pressure, without drama. Charlie would be removed entirely. Rebecca as well, by extension and by intention. Melissa would receive a modest portion, enough to honor the fact that she still wrestled with guilt, still had good left in her. And Alex, who showed kindness without calculation, sincerity without agenda, he would inherit the cabin, the full trust, the land, the responsibility. Frank listened, breath steadying. Something inside him, something bruised, began to realign into quiet determination. "Are you sure?" Harold asked. "This is a firm line, there's no going back without consequences." Frank nodded. They drew the line first. Harold began drafting the documents, typing with practiced precision, while the winter light filtered through the office window. Each click of the keyboard felt like a decision being locked into place, a piece of Frank reclaiming what had slipped from him. When the papers were ready, Harold turned them toward him. "This," he said, tapping the trust document, "secures the cabin exactly where you want it to go. No one can contest it." Frank picked up the pen. His hand didn't shake, not this time. He signed the first page. Then the second. Then the third. Each stroke felt like a boundary being rebuilt, a door being closed gently but firmly to protect what mattered most. Not out of revenge, out of clarity. When he finished, he set the pen down with a soft exhale. The room felt lighter, even though nothing outside it had changed yet. Harold gathered the papers. "I'll have everything filed by tomorrow morning." Frank stood, pulling on his coat again. "Thank you, Harold." "You're doing the right thing," Harold said. "You're choosing who deserves your legacy, not who assumes it." As Frank stepped outside, the air was cold enough to sting his lungs. But this time the cold felt clean, sharp, awake. He walked toward his truck with a steadiness that hadn't been there hours earlier. The betrayal still hurt. But it no longer owned him. He had taken back control. And now, the people who thought he was weak were about to learn just how wrong they were. Frank heard the crunch of tires on snow before he saw the car. He was chopping kindling behind the cabin when the familiar silver SUV rolled up the driveway, exhaust curling into the cold morning air. For a brief second, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, Charlie and Rebecca were here because they cared, because they sensed distance, because they wanted to repair something. But the moment they stepped out, Frank saw the truth written plainly in their eyes. They scanned the cabin with the detached interest of people appraising property, not visiting a parent. Charlie's gaze lingered on the roofline, the porch, the lake view. Rebecca looked at the windows, the siding, the path, like someone mentally staging renovations. Not one of them looked at Frank first. Charlie forced a smile as he approached. "Dad, we were in the area and thought we'd check in, see how you're doing." Frank wiped his hands on his gloves, steadying his expression. "I'm doing just fine," he said. "Come on in." Inside, the warmth from the wood stove greeted them, along with the last remnants of the Christmas decorations Frank still hadn't taken down. The place smelled faintly of pine and the cedar oil he used to polish the shelves. But none of it softened Rebecca's calculating eyes as she stepped inside, her heels clicking on the worn hardwood floor. She did a slow sweep of the space, her gaze moving over the walls, the fireplace, the handmade furniture. Not with nostalgia, with assessment. "You know," she said lightly, "this cabin would make a great Airbnb." Frank paused mid-step. "Is that right?" "Oh, absolutely," she continued. "Rustic charm is very marketable. People pay top dollar for authenticity these days." She smiled thinly, the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "It's practically wasted sitting here unused most of the year." Charlie coughed softly, avoiding Frank's eyes, but he didn't disagree. He slipped his hands into his coat pockets and let Rebecca speak for both of them. Frank simply nodded and gestured toward the kitchen. "Tea." "Yes, please," Rebecca said, already drifting toward the fireplace like she wanted to imagine it in a rental listing. Charlie followed her but didn't sit. He kept shifting, glancing at Rebecca as if waiting for some signal. Frank watched them from the stove as he prepared the tea, the kettle whistling just loud enough to fill the tense silence. When he carried the mugs to the living room, Rebecca had already pulled a folder from her oversized purse. "Oh," she said brightly, as if the thought had just come to her. "I brought a little something, just in case you're ready to simplify things, make life easier." She placed the folder on the coffee table with deliberate care. Frank looked at it, then at her. "Simplify what exactly?" She gave a soft laugh. "Oh, Dad, you know, managing a place like this must be getting harder. The snow, the upkeep, the repairs, we just want to help." Charlie finally spoke. "Yeah, we figured if you wanted to sign a few things, we could take some responsibility off your hands." Frank stared at the folder. He didn't reach for it. "I see," he said quietly. Rebecca took a sip of tea, then leaned forward as if speaking gently to someone slow to understand. "This is just the preliminary paperwork. Transfer of management rights, some property simplification documents, nothing major. If you sign now, we can handle the rest. You won't have to worry about anything." Frank nodded slowly, carefully masking the sharp clarity growing inside him. "That sounds complicated." "Oh, not at all," Rebecca insisted. "Everything's straightforward. You wouldn't need to read the fine print. We already talked to someone who can guide us." Charlie shot her a quick look, one that told Frank this was rehearsed, practiced, expected. Frank lifted his mug, letting the steam warm his face. He murmured. "I appreciate you thinking of me." Rebecca smiled, pleased. "So you're open to it." Frank let a beat of silence stretch, just long enough to pull every ounce of their entitlement to the surface. "I'll think about it," he said. Rebecca blinked, thrown off. "Think about it, Dad, it's just—" "I said," Frank repeated gently, "I'll think about it." Charlie exhaled, frustrated. Rebecca pressed her lips together but forced a polite nod. They both sensed something in Frank they hadn't seen before, resistance. Still, they didn't know the full truth. They didn't know the estate plan was already changed. They didn't know they were no longer beneficiaries. They didn't know the cabin they were mentally furnishing for renters was no longer their future prize. They didn't know Frank had stopped being the man they could push. As they gathered their things to leave, Rebecca slid the folder closer to him. "Just read it over," she said. "We'll come back in a few days." Frank W. out them to the door, keeping his expression neutral. They waved goodbye with forced cheer, unaware that the ground beneath their assumptions had already been pulled out. When the SUV finally disappeared down the road, Frank picked up the folder on the coffee table. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He already knew exactly what he was going to do, and none of it involved giving them a single inch of the world they thought they deserved. Frank heard the knock just after noon, a soft, hesitant tapping that didn't match Charlie's confident rhythm or Rebecca's impatient pounding. When he opened the door, Melissa stood on the porch bundled in a wool coat, her eyes already glassy with something heavier than the cold. "Dad, can I come in?" Frank stepped aside without a word. Melissa slipped past him, brushing snow from her sleeves. She looked around the cabin, the Christmas decorations still hanging, the fire burning low, and her expression folded into something like guilt, something like longing. "I should have come earlier," she murmured. Frank didn't push. He waited as she removed her gloves and sat on the couch, hands twisting in her lap. She looked smaller than usual, as if the weight she carried had pressed her down into herself. "I needed to talk to you alone," she began, voice trembling. "Without Charlie, without Rebecca." Frank lowered himself into the chair across from her. "I figured as much." Melissa swallowed hard. "I know you heard something, or at least Alex told me he visited and said too much. I didn't want you to find out that way." Frank held her gaze. "I heard everything I needed to." She closed her eyes briefly, pained. "Dad, I'm so sorry." The apology came out in pieces, cracked and uneven. She pressed her hands to her face, elbows on her knees as if bracing herself. "Charlie pressured me," she confessed. "He wanted me on his side when he talked to you about assisted living. He said it would look more responsible if both your kids agreed." Frank's heart sank, not from shock but from confirmation. "And you agreed?" Melissa nodded miserably. "I didn't want to, I knew it wasn't right, but I was exhausted, work, the kids, everything. And Charlie made it sound reasonable, like you needed help and didn't want to admit it." Frank listened, the hurt settling in deep, familiar places. He rubbed a hand over his jaw. "Melissa, being tired doesn't make betrayal easier to swallow." She flinched, tears spilled, uncontained now. I know, I hate myself for it. I should have defended you. I should have told him to drop it." Frank leaned forward slightly. "Why didn't you?" She hesitated, the answer catching in her throat. "Because assisting living would have made my life easier." The words hung between them, heavy and humiliating. Melissa covered her mouth as if trying to take them back. Frank inhaled slowly. The pain felt sharp, but it wasn't anger that rose first, it was sadness. Deep, old sadness. He reached across the table and rested his hand over hers. "Don't let convenience replace love, Melissa. Not with me. Not with anyone." She cried harder, but she didn't pull away. "I don't want to lose you, Dad. I just got swept up in everything. And Rebecca, she talks so confidently, like she knows what's best. And sometimes I just let her." At the sound of Rebecca's name, Frank's stomach knotted. "Tell me the truth. How much of this came from her?" Melissa hesitated again, then broke. "Most of it," she whispered. "She's been planning what to do with the cabin for months. She says it's wasted on you, that it should be sold right away after you transition." The euphemism hit harder than the word itself. Frank felt something in him fracture, a quiet but irreversible crack. Transition. Sold immediately, all before he was even gone. The cabin he had built with Margaret, shaped board by board with their own hands, reduced to a line item in Rebecca's financial planning. His heart didn't just hurt, it recoiled. "She wants the money now," Melissa continued softly. "She talks about renovations and profits as if you're not even part of the equation. She said once you're in assisted living, everything will be easier to handle. Frank stared into the fire, its orange glow flickering across his face. He felt the betrayal differently this time, less like a wound and more like a pattern he could finally see clearly. "This isn't just betrayal," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "It's greed." Melissa wiped her cheeks, nodding vigorously. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I never wanted this. I never wanted to hurt you." Frank stood slowly, letting the weight of her confession settle fully in his chest. Then he walked around the table, sat beside her, and pulled her into a gentle, steady embrace. "I forgive you," he said, "but forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting, and things are going to change." Melissa clutched his arm, desperate, relieved, scared all at once. "What are you going to do?" Frank didn't answer right away. He looked toward the window, where the cabin sat framed in winter light. Their legacy, his life's work, the place he refused to see taken by entitlement. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, steady, unmistakably resolved. "I'm going to make sure no one can take what wasn't theirs to claim." Melissa's breath hitched, but she didn't ask more. She didn't have to. The decision had already been made. New Year's Eve arrived without fanfare. No clinking glasses, no countdowns, no family voices echoing through the cabin. Just a soft winter hush settling over the lake, the kind that made the world feel paused rather than celebrating. Frank sat in his favorite armchair with a wool blanket over his legs, the fire crackling low beside him. Alone, but for the first time in weeks the solitude didn't sting. It felt necessary, clearing, clarifying. The cabin glowed with warm lamplight, and Frank listened to the faint pop of distant fireworks reflecting off the frozen lake. Each burst echoed lightly in the stillness, like soft reminders of a world choosing celebration while he chose reflection. He raised a mug of hot cider toward the window in a quiet toast, not to the year behind him, but to the resolve shaping inside him. "Here's to new beginnings," he murmured. On the table beside him lay a blank sheet of paper and an envelope, his pen resting on top like an invitation. He picked it up slowly, rolling the weight of it in his fingers before setting pen to paper. The first words came haltingly, but then they flowed, steady and unfiltered. "To my children." He didn't write accusations, he didn't write anger. He wrote truth measured, clear, undeniable. He wrote about the hurt, the disappointment, the disbelief of hearing his future planned without him. He wrote about the cabin, what it meant, what he built, what he could not allow to be reduced to profit or convenience. And he wrote most of all about respect, how easily it had been withdrawn, how fully he intended to reclaim his own dignity. When he finished, he read the letter twice. It wasn't a goodbye, it was a boundary, one long overdue. He folded it neatly, slid it into the envelope and set it aside. It would be mailed when the time was right, not tonight. Tonight was for action. With a steady breath, he pulled his laptop closer and logged into his accounts. The trust Harold created sat clearly at the top of the page, already active, already securely controlling the cabin's legal fate. Frank clicked through the menus until he reached his property tax portal. For 30 years, taxes on the cabin had been paid automatically from his personal account, a responsibility he'd carried without complaint. But now, as he hovered over the Cancel Automatic Payments button, he felt a symbolic shift. This wasn't him abandoning responsibility. It was him transferring it, intentionally, strategically, to the trust designed to protect what mattered. He clicked. A confirmation message appeared. Cancelled. The trust would handle it now. Not Charlie, not Rebecca, not anyone waiting for him to weaken. The small victory settled warmly in his chest. Next, he opened his calendar and scheduled 2 meetings, one with Harold, one with Pastor Judy. Not for legal updates, that part was already secure. He wanted Harold's counsel on the next steps of communication. And he wanted Judy's presence, her steady voice, her perspective, because she understood the deeper wounds, the ones a lawyer couldn't draft his way through. With the meeting set, Frank moved to the final task of the night. He stood and walked slowly around the cabin, checking every window latch, every log in the woodpile, every photograph on the wall. Margaret's picture on the mantel caught his eye, her smile soft and knowing, the way she always looked when she knew he'd come to an important conclusion. He lifted the frame gently. "I finally understand," he whispered, "what to protect and who to protect it from." He placed it back, this time angled slightly toward the room's center, as if she were watching over the space more deliberately. Then he opened the drawer where he kept important papers and took out one last document, his finalized trust arrangement. He read it again, line by line, not because he doubted it, but because it gave him strength. Every line pointed to Alex as the rightful steward of the cabin. Every clause ensured that entitlement would never override intention. Not again. Not ever. Frank exhaled deeply, the kind of breath that cleared months of heaviness from the ribs. His children had canceled Christmas without hesitation. They'd taken a tradition, a symbol, a ritual built across decades, and discarded it when it no longer fit their convenience. He set the trust document down, his jaw tightening with quiet resolve. "Well," he said into the dim cabin, "they canceled Christmas." He turned off the lamp, letting the fire be the room's only light. "So I'll cancel what they were really waiting for." The crackling fire punctua. Ted the moment, its glow reflecting off the trust paperwork like a seal of finality. Outside, the midnight fireworks began, color exploding in the sky while Frank stood in the quiet of his doorway, not celebrating the end of a year but marking the start of a new chapter. A chapter in which he, not his children, held the reins. And this time he wouldn't let go. Frank had barely finished stacking the last piece of firewood beside the shed when he heard a car pull up the driveway. He recognized the engine's hum before he even turned, Charlie's SUV. The timing wasn't a coincidence. Nothing was any more. Frank wiped his hands on his coat and walked toward the porch just as his son stepped out, clutching something under his arm. Brochures. Dozens of them. Photos of smiling seniors, manicured gardens, spotless hallways, and phrases like stress-free living and enjoy your golden years printed in cheerful fonts. Marketing for a life they wanted to push him into. "Dad," Charlie said, forcing a warm tone that didn't match the tension in his shoulders. "Got a minute?" Frank nodded slowly. "I suppose I do." Charlie climbed the steps, already setting the brochures on the porch railing like a salesman arranging his pitch. "I wanted to talk to you about, well, about the future." Frank folded his arms. "My future or yours?" Charlie blinked, caught off guard, then gave a rehearsed chuckle. "Come on, Dad, this isn't about me, it's about you. It's time, you can't live alone anymore." The sentence hung in the cold air, wrapped in false concern. Frank let it settle, studying his son's face. Charlie looked determined, but beneath that, nervous, like a man walking a tightrope he hoped no one else could see. "I can't live alone," Frank repeated. "Is that what you think?" Before Charlie could answer, Frank stepped off the porch. "Come here." He led his son to the side of the cabin, where several heavy birch logs waited to be split. Frank grabbed the axe, his movements deliberate but smooth. He planted a log, lifted the axe high, and brought it down in one clean, powerful motion. The wood split apart with a satisfying crack. Then he grabbed another. And another. By the fifth, Charlie's shoulders had slumped, the brochures forgotten. Frank wiped his brow. "Anything else you'd like me to demonstrate? Maybe hauling the garbage bins, fixing a shutter, clearing snow off the roof?" Charlie's jaw tightened. "Dad, that's not the point." "Looks like the point to me." Before Charlie could respond, the passenger door opened and Rebecca stepped out, wrapped in a stylish coat far too thin for Minnesota winter. She strode toward them, arms crossed tight. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," she said. "You're being stubborn, Frank. You're 72. You should be thinking realistically." Frank studied her face. No concern, no softness. Only agitation, the kind that comes when plans start slipping through fingers. Realistically, Frank echoed, meaning doing what you want. Rebecca rolled her eyes, meaning doing what's practical. You can't keep up this rugged loner performance forever. These places, she gestured at the brochures, are designed for people like you. People like me, Frank repeated quietly. Rebecca pressed on, her tone sharpening. Charlie and Melissa are worried. You should consider how hard this is for them. Frank felt something cold settle in his chest, but he kept his voice calm. They're worried? Funny. I don't remember them being worried at Christmas. Rebecca stiffened. Charlie stepped forward quickly, trying to soften the moment. Dad, listen. Mom would have wanted this. She wouldn't want you isolated or struggling. She'd want you safe. Frank went still. Using Margaret, that was their angle now. He looked at his son, and when he spoke, his voice was low but steady. Your mother would have wanted honesty, respect, a family that doesn't plan someone's life behind their back. Charlie's expression cracked for a moment, guilt, fear, frustration all tangled together. Rebecca stepped in again, voice clipped. Emotions aside, the paperwork is ready whenever you are. Ah, there it was, the real reason for the visit. Frank stepped back onto the porch, leaving the two of them on the snow-packed ground. He opened the front door just enough to signal the conversation was ending. I'll think about it, he said. Rebecca scoffed. Frank. I said, Frank repeated more firmly now, I'll think about it. Charlie exhaled, defeated. Rebecca clenched her jaw, the loss of control evident in every muscle of her face. Frank gave them a small nod, polite, final, drive safe. He stepped inside and closed the door. The latch clicked with a quiet finality, sealing out their voices, their pressure, their manipulation. But inside the cabin something else clicked into place. A decision, sharp, solid, irrevocable. He walked to the fireplace, warmed his hands, and allowed himself the faintest, knowing smile. They thought they were pushing him toward assisted living. All they'd done was push him toward finishing the plan he'd already set in motion. And now nothing, not guilt, not pressure, not family ties, would stop what came next. The first sign that something unusual had happened was the knock, sharp, official, not the friendly tap of a neighbor or the thud of a package drop-off, a sound that made Charlie look up from his laptop with a faint crease in his brow. When he opened the door, a mail carrier stood there holding a clipboard and a thick certified envelope. Signature required, the carrier said. Charlie signed automatically, barely glancing at the label, until his eyes caught the sender's name. Harold Kent, attorney at law. His stomach tightened. He carried the envelope inside like a bomb he wasn't sure how to disarm. Rebecca noticed immediately. What's that? She asked. From Dad's lawyer. His voice was thin, uncertain. Rebecca crossed the room in 2 quick strides. Open it. Charlie sat at the dining table, sliding his thumb under the seal with a tension that made his hand unsteady. Papers slid out, several pages thick, bearing the unmistakable formatting of legal documents. At the top, Amended Estate Trust, Frank Dawson. He felt the color drain from his face. Rebecca hovered behind him. Well, what is it? Charlie's eyes scanned the first page quickly, searching for something familiar. His name, his inheritance, the cabin he'd spent years assuming would one day be his responsibility. Then he found it. And the world went still. His name was nowhere near the cabin. Not on the first page. Not on the second. Not anywhere. Instead, the trust designated the property entirely to Alex. Charlie's breath hitched. He changed everything. Rebecca leaned over his shoulder, reading along. With each sentence her face twisted tighter, her mouth sharpening into a furious grimace. He left the cabin to Alex, she snapped, to a teenager. Charlie swallowed hard. It's all legally binding. Harold signed it. Dad signed it. There's nothing here for us." Rebecca's voice rose high and shrill. "Is he out of his mind? This is delusional. He's clearly not competent anymore. This is senility." She paced the room, fists clenched, hair swinging with every step. Charlie just stared at the document, shoulders slumped as if the ground had tilted beneath him. "He cut us out," Charlie whispered. "He really cut us out." Before Rebecca could fire off another round of outrage, Melissa entered through the back door, carrying groceries. She paused when she saw the tension in the room. "What's going on?" Charlie slid the second certified envelope across the table. "Yours arrived too." Melissa hesitated before opening it. Her hands didn't shake, but her breath did. She read slowly, absorbing each line, her expression softening rather than tightening. She closed the letter gently. "I understand," she murmured. Rebecca spun toward her. "You understand, he gave you almost nothing." Melissa held her ground. "It's more than I deserve after everything I agreed to. And she swallowed, guilt flashing across her face. "He still gave me something. That means he hasn't given up on me completely." Rebecca stared at her as if she'd spoken a foreign language. "You're siding with him." "I'm recognizing what I did," Melissa said quietly. "Maybe it's time you do the same." Rebecca scoffed, furious. "I didn't do anything wrong. I was planning for our future. He's the one being irrational." But before she could continue, Charlie pulled his face out of his hands. "There's another one," he said numbly, pointing toward the counter. A small envelope addressed to Alex Dawson. The three of them looked at it in silence. Charlie didn't open it. He couldn't bring himself to, but later that afternoon Alex would. And when he did, he would find no legal jargon, no cold instructions. Just a note written in Frank's steady handwriting. "You showed up when others didn't. You cared without asking for anything back. This cabin is yours because love, real love, deserves to be honored." Alex would read it twice, then a third time, and feel something tighten deep in his chest. Not pride, but responsibility. Back in Charlie's kitchen, silence hung thick. Then Charlie stood abruptly, pushing back his chair. "This isn't final," he said. "It can't be. We need to talk to him, all of us." Rebecca latched onto the idea instantly. "Yes, a family meeting. We'll explain why this can't stand. We'll demand answers." Melissa didn't say anything. She just looked down at her letter, fingers brushing the edges. Not fighting, not arguing, just absorbing the consequences of a truth she'd ignored. Charlie gathered the documents and shoved them back into the envelope. "We're going to the cabin," he said. "Tonight." Rebecca grabbed her coat, fueled by outrage. Melissa moved more slowly, burdened by something heavier than anger. And as Charlie locked the door behind them, gripping the envelope like a verdict he refused to accept, one thing became clear. This wasn't going to be a conversation. It was going to be a reckoning. The sun had barely dipped behind the pines when Frank heard the tires grinding up his snowy driveway, too fast, too aggressive. He recognized the sound of Charlie's SUV before it even came into view. By the time the headlights flashed against the cabin windows, Frank knew this wasn't a visit. It was an ambush. He stood from his chair and set aside the book he hadn't really been reading. The door flew open before he reached it. Charlie barreled inside, face flushed and eyes blazing. Rebecca wasn't far behind, her expression sharpened into something cold and furious. "You had no right," Charlie shouted, voice cracking at the top. "None." Frank didn't flinch. "Evening to you too." Rebecca shoved the certified envelope toward him like it was evidence of a crime. "Are you out of your mind? You're ruining our future." Frank looked at the envelope, then at her. "Your future," he repeated quietly. "I see." Charlie stepped in front of Rebecca, anger spilling out in frantic waves. "Dad, what were you thinking? Giving the cabin to a teenager, cutting us out. This was supposed to come to us, you know that." Frank folded his arms, grounding himself. It was never promised, and property isn't inherited by assumption or entitlement. Rebecca scoffed, a harsh metallic sound in the warm cabin air. This place is wasted on you. You barely use half the rooms. You keep it stuck in the dark ages. And now you're making irrational decisions because you're, she gestured toward him dismissively, old. Frank's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed even. I'm old enough to see who values me and who values my property. Rebecca's lips curled. Your judgment is failing. That trust is a bad decision from a man who shouldn't be making legal choices. You're talking about legal choices, Frank asked, lifting a brow. When you pushed my children to get me into assisted living for convenience. Charlie ran a hand through his hair, pacing. Dad, we were trying to help. To help yourselves, Frank corrected. For a moment, the only sound was the fire cracking softly in the hearth. Rebecca stepped closer, anger sharpening into something venomous. You're throwing everything away over hurt feelings from Christmas. Holidays change. Deal with it. Frank's eyes darkened. He stepped forward, straightening his spine in a way that made him seem taller than his 72 years. You canceled Christmas, he said slowly, and you canceled more than you know. The silence that followed was heavy, charged. That's ridiculous, Rebecca snapped. We didn't cancel anything. You did, Frank replied. You canceled tradition, respect, family. And the moment you treated me like a burden instead of a father, that's when I decided to protect what I built. Rebecca opened her mouth again, but another voice broke through the tension. Dad's right. Melissa stepped inside quietly, snow still clinging to her coat. She looked between Charlie and Rebecca, her expression full of conflict but firm. Melissa, stay out of this, Charlie barked. No, she said, I won't. Dad didn't do anything wrong. He reacted to what we did, to what you pushed us into. She turned to Frank, her eyes soft with remorse. He's protecting himself because we failed too. Rebecca's face twisted. Oh, of course you take his side now. Enjoy your little slice of nothing, because that's all he left you. Melissa didn't rise to it. I'm grateful for what he gave me, even if it's small, because it's more than we deserved. Charlie grabbed the envelope again, shaking it at Frank. This isn't final. We're going to fight it. You can't just erase your own son. Frank met his stare calmly. I didn't erase you. You erased yourself when you stopped treating me like family. Charlie inhaled sharply, fury climbing up his throat. We'll get a lawyer. We'll challenge the trust. We'll. You won't win, Frank said softly, and you know it. Your lawyer already told you what a trust means. Charlie's face crumpled into frustration, into something almost desperate. So that's it. You choose Alex over your own children. Frank didn't hesitate. I chose the one who showed up. The words landed like a slap. Rebecca stepped back, stunned for a moment before recovering into anger. This isn't over, she hissed. Charlie slammed the envelope against the table and stormed toward the door, fury radiating off him with every step. We're not letting this stand, Dad. You'll hear from us. He yanked the door open, cold air blasting into the cabin. Melissa lingered for a moment, eyes full of apology and shame. I'm sorry, she whispered, for everything. Frank nodded, his expression softening only for her. Then Charlie shouted from outside, We'll fight this. The door slammed, the SUV roared to life. Frank stood in the quiet that followed, the fire flickering behind him, his heartbeat steady. He hadn't just faced his children. He'd faced the truth. And the next stage of this fight was only beginning. Charlie sat stiffly in the leather chair across from his attorney, his knee bouncing uncontrollably. The office was warm, lined with polished shelves and framed certificates, but he felt cold. Cold the way a man feels when the world stops matching the future he planned. His attorney, a seasoned man with silver hair and calm eyes, finished reading the trust documents in silence. Finally, he looked up. Charlie, it's airtight. Charlie blinked. What do you mean airtight? Nothing is airtight. A properly executed trust, the attorney said gently, is, your father had full legal capacity when he signed this. Witnessed, notarized, filed. There's no loophole. Charlie leaned forward, voice cracking. But he wasn't thinking straight, he was emotional. Emotion isn't incompetence, the attorney replied. He knew exactly what he was doing. Charlie looked away, jaw clenching. He gave everything to a 16-year-old kid. How is that responsible? The law doesn't decide based on your opinion of the beneficiary, the attorney said. Only on the process, and the process here is perfect. The words felt like a verdict, a final one. While Charlie's world was collapsing in that office, Rebecca stood outside in the parking lot, pacing with her phone pressed tight to her ear. She dialed Harold Kent for the third time. Finally, the call connected. Harold, she snapped, you need to explain this trust. Clearly, Frank wasn't guided properly and… Mrs. Dawson, Harold interrupted, voice firm, almost icy. I cannot discuss your father-in-law's private legal decisions with you. This is absurd, she hissed. You helped him ruin our future. I helped him protect his, Harold corrected. Any further inquiries should go through your own counsel. He did the call. Rebecca stared at the phone, stunned. Then fury erupted across her face as she threw it back into her purse and stormed toward the car. Her plans, vacation rentals, renovation budgets, projected profits, were slipping from her grip. And she wasn't a woman who handled loss gracefully. That's when she decided on her next move, a desperate one. 2 days later, Frank opened his door to find a stern-looking physician accompanied by Rebecca, who stood behind him with her arms folded and her chin lifted. Dad, she said sweetly, this doctor is here to do a routine competency evaluation, just to clear up this confusion. Frank's eyes narrowed. You brought a doctor to my doorstep without asking me. It's necessary, Rebecca insisted. You signed documents that don't reflect rational decision-making. Frank stepped aside to let the doctor in but kept his gaze on Rebecca, unflinching. You're testing the wrong person. The exam took an hour. The doctor asked questions about memory, logic, numbers, current events, even spatial reasoning. Frank answered each calmly, precisely, with the clarity of a man who had lived a full life and remembered every inch of it. When the doctor finished, he spoke quietly but decisively. Mr. Dawson is completely competent. His cognitive function is excellent for his age. There is no basis for concern. Rebecca's jaw dropped. Are you sure he forgets things? He's 72. The doctor bristled. Age is not incompetence, Mrs. Dawson, and if you request another exam, I will personally report this as harassment. With that, he left. The moment the door shut, Rebecca snapped. The pressure she'd been building for weeks erupted in a raw, unfiltered explosion. This is unbelievable, she shouted. You're being selfish, Frank, completely selfish. You're throwing away security for what? Some emotional tantrum because we didn't come to your outdated cabin on Christmas. Frank stared at her, steady as stone. You wanted my home, Rebecca, not me. She didn't deny it. She just glared, breathing hard, her composure finally stripped away. That was the moment Melissa, who had arrived mid-exam and witnessed the fallout from the hallway, stepped forward. Rebecca, she said quietly, stop. Rebecca spun toward her. Oh, please, don't pretend you're innocent. You were on board in the beginning. And I was wrong, Melissa said firmly. But you, she pointed at Rebecca with shaking fingers. You're showing exactly why Dad made the choice he did. Rebecca's face twisted, part rage, part panic. You don't get it. None of you get it. That cabin was supposed to be ours. It was never yours, Melissa said. It was his. Rebecca turned on her heel and stormed out of the cabin, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. Charlie followed her a moment later, shoulders sagging, defeated. He didn't yell this time. He didn't threaten lawyers. He just met his father's eyes, swallowed hard, and stepped outside without a word. When the car finally disappeared down the drive, Melissa exhaled, long and trembling. "Dad, I'm so sorry." Frank placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't need to be. The truth always looks louder when people lose the thing they tried to take." She nodded, wiping her eyes. Outside, the world was quiet again. Inside, the law had spoken. And Frank, fully competent, legally protected, morally justified, stood exactly where he belonged. In control of everything they once assumed was theirs. News in a small northern Minnesota town doesn't spread, it drifts, settles, and warms or chills the air depending on the story. And Frank's story, well, it didn't take long before people knew the broad strokes. They didn't know every detail, but they knew enough. That a father had been pushed, tested, cornered by those who should have protected him. That he'd stood his ground. That the trust filed with Harold Kent wasn't about spite, it was about survival. By the end of the week, Frank could feel it. A shift in the way people greeted him at the diner, the grocery store, the post office. Not pity, not curiosity, something gentler, something like solidarity. "Hang in there, Frank," Mr. Havorson said, patting his shoulder as he passed him outside the hardware store. "You did the right thing," Mrs. Klein whispered while bagging her produce. Even the local bartender, who rarely offered more than a grunt, slid Frank a free cup of coffee and muttered, "Takes guts to stand up for yourself at your age." Frank wasn't used to attention, but he accepted each gesture with quiet gratitude. It made the loneliness of the holiday less sharp, gave shape to something he hadn't felt since Margaret died, a sense of being held by the world around him. Still, the moment that meant the most came one afternoon, when Pastor Judy knocked gently on his door. She stepped inside carrying a small tin of cookies and the warm, steady presence she always brought into a room. "Heard you've been going through a storm," she said softly. Frank exhaled. "Seems that way." She studied him for a moment, the firelight catching her kind eyes. "I know your heart is bruised, but don't forget, you're not alone. You have a community that loves you, people who have seen your character for decades. You're more than what your children failed to recognize." Frank looked down, feeling the truth of her words land on the places still raw. "It's strange," he admitted. "Losing the people who share your blood makes you feel like maybe everything slips away at once." "But it doesn't," Judy said. "Roots don't disappear just because a branch grows wrong." The simplicity of the metaphor steadied him. Then she added, "We could use an extra pair of hands at the community center tomorrow. Winter festival's coming up. Think you could help us decorate?" Frank felt the faintest smile. "I suppose I can manage that." The next afternoon, the community center buzzed with cheerful chaos. Boxes of paper snowflakes, garlands, and handmade lanterns scattered across tables. The walls echoed with laughter and the clatter of ladders being dragged into place. Frank stepped inside and was greeted like someone returning home after a long absence. "There he is. Grab him, he's tall enough to reach the beams. Frank, you remember how to hang lights straighter than any of us." They handed him a spool of twinkling lights, and for the first time since Christmas Eve, his shoulders loosened. He worked alongside neighbors who'd known him since his carpentry days, people who still respected the man he was, capable, steady, valued. While he was adjusting the lights over a doorframe, the doors behind him swung open, letting in a gust of cold air and one familiar voice. "Grandp. Hey." Alex rushed in, cheeks flushed from the wind, eyes bright as ever. "Mom said you'd be here. Can I help?" Frank chuckled. "You sure can. Grab that box of lanterns." They worked side by side for nearly an hour, hanging lights, arranging decorations, untangling cords that somehow tied themselves into knots. At one point, Alex climbed a short ladder while Frank steadied it, and something about the moment, the quiet teamwork, the shared concentration, felt like time folding in on itself. A memory of raising his own children, of guiding small hands and steadying wobbly feet. Only this time, the warmth didn't come with heartbreak. This time it came with belonging. When the last set of lanterns flickered to life, Alex stepped back beside his grandfather, admiring their work. "Looks amazing," he said. Frank nodded, but his eyes weren't on the decorations. They were on Alex, who'd shown up without being asked, without wanting anything, without calculating what he might gain. "You know," Frank said quietly, "people talk a lot about family, blood, legacy." He paused, choosing each word carefully. "But I'm starting to think family is who shows up when the world turns cold." Alex glanced up at him. "I'll always show up, Grandpa." Frank felt something settle into place, something steady, warm, anchoring. Later, as he packed up tools and listened to the gentle hum of neighbors chatting and laughing, he realized the truth he'd been pushing away. Family wasn't always blood. Sometimes it was choice. Sometimes it was community. Sometimes it was a grandson who cared more than entire generations before him. And as he stepped out into the crisp evening air, the lights glowing behind him, he knew one thing for certain. His world wasn't shrinking. It was shifting. And in that shift, he was beginning to rise again. By the time the new year settled in, the tension inside Charlie and Rebecca's home had thickened into something heavy and unavoidable. What used to be small disagreements, about bills, about the kids' schedules, about household chores, now ignited into arguments with sharp edges. And every spark came from the same source, the cabin they no longer had any claim to. Rebecca slammed a stack of papers onto the kitchen table, startling Charlie out of the daze he'd sunk into while staring at his untouched dinner. "You're giving up," she snapped. "You're just rolling over because your father got sentimental and handed everything to a kid." Charlie rubbed his temples. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, shoulders sagging. "Becca, we talked to lawyers. They told us the truth. The trust is solid. There's nothing left to fight." "That's because you're not fighting hard enough," she shot back. "You're acting like it's over, and it is not over." He looked up at her then, really looked, and something in his expression shifted. There was confusion there, yes, but also dawning clarity. Clarity he'd been avoiding. "When did this become about fighting harder?" he asked softly, "and not about family?" Rebecca scoffed and crossed her arms. "Family? Charlie, wake up. This is about our future, our security. Do you know how much we could have done with that property, the investments, the rentals? Your salary alone won't carry us forever." It slipped out too quickly, too honestly. Charlie's breath stilled. So this was never about Dad's well-being. It was about money. Rebecca rolled her eyes. "Don't say it like that. It was about planning, about being realistic." "Realistic," Charlie whispered. "You were talking about him like he was already gone." Rebecca's jaw tightened. "Because that's how adults plan ahead. You can't cling to emotions when property is involved." Charlie leaned back in his chair, the truth finally landing with full weight. "I didn't want him in assisted living. You talked me into it." "I guided you," she corrected, "because I'm the only one thinking rationally." The air between them felt like a fault line. 2 days later, the crack widened. Melissa came by to drop off a forgotten homework folder for one of the kids. She stepped inside just in time to hear Rebecca's voice explode from the kitchen. "I am sick of living like this. We were supposed to have something secure, something valuable, and your father ruined it. You let him ruin it." Melissa froze near the hallway entrance. Charlie stood with his hands on the counter, head bowed. He wasn't yelling back. He wasn't even defending himself. He just absorbed the words like a man too weary to argue. Rebecca paced in circles, hair disheveled, face flushed with anger. "You promised that the cabin would come to us someday, that we'd renovate it, rent it, sell it if we needed to. I planned our financial future around it." "Maybe that was the problem," Charlie murmured. planning our future around something that wasn't ours yet. Rebecca stopped mid-step and stared at him like he'd committed treason. If you had pushed harder, if you had gotten him to sign earlier, none of this would have happened. Melissa stepped fully into view now. Rebecca, stop. Rebecca spun toward her. Stay out of this. You don't get it. You got something in the trust. I got almost nothing, Melissa replied softly, and it's still more than I deserve. Oh, spare me the emotional epiphanies, Rebecca sneered. Some of us actually care about stability. Stability, Melissa repeated, or greed? Rebecca's face twisted. You think I'm greedy. You think wanting a future is greedy. Frank is the selfish one, clinging to a cabin he barely uses, punishing us for one holiday. That holiday meant something to him, Charlie whispered, and we ignored it. Rebecca threw her hands up. You are unbelievable. I'm fighting for us, for our security, and you're too weak to fight back. Weak, Charlie's voice cracked. I never meant to hurt Dad. I never meant to push him. He choked on the words, emotion breaking loose. I just wanted peace. I didn't want to lose my family. Rebecca's expression hardened at his vulnerability. Then grow up, because if you don't fix this, if you don't get that cabin back, I'm done. I'm not staying in a marriage where my partner refuses to protect our future. Charlie stared at her, stunned. You're threatening to leave me over a house. It's not just a house, she said coldly. It's the only smart thing we were ever going to have. Melissa stepped closer to her brother, instinctively protective. Charlie, you don't have to let her talk to you like that. Rebecca grabbed her coat off the hook. I'll be back when you've decided whether you're a husband or a coward. She slammed the door so hard the frame shook. Silence pressed down on the room. Charlie braced himself against the counter, shoulders collapsing. Tears he'd been holding back for months, finally escaped. I didn't want any of this, he whispered. I never wanted to hurt him. I just thought we'd get there someday. Melissa placed a steady hand on his back. Maybe you still can, but not like this. Charlie didn't answer. He couldn't. Because in that moment, as the echo of Rebecca's ultimatum faded, he felt the first deep rupture in a marriage built on expectations, not love. And something inside him finally cracked open. The sky was a pale winter blue when Frank pulled up to Alex's school, the truck engine humming softly as students spilled out into the parking lot in noisy clusters. Alex spotted the truck immediately. Instead of waving, he jogged toward it with that familiar brightness in his step, a brightness Frank had been clinging to more than he realized. Hey, Grandpa, Alex said, climbing into the passenger seat with a blast of cold air. What are we doing today? Mom said you needed help with something at the cabin. Frank put the truck in gear. Not help, company. Alex grinned. Well, I'm good at that. Frank smiled faintly as he steered toward the lake road. Yes, he said quietly, you are. The drive was peaceful. Snow drifted lightly from the treetops, catching sunlight as the truck wound its way through the pines. Alex talked about school, a science project, and an argument he'd overheard between his dad and Rebecca. Frank listened, offering small nods and murmurs, not interrupting. He needed this moment to feel natural, to feel like family again. When they reached the cabin, Alex stepped out and inhaled the crisp air. I missed this place. Frank led him inside, where a fire crackled gently and the table was cleared except for a thick folder placed neatly in the center. Alex noticed it immediately. What's that? Frank took a steady breath. Something I want you to see. They sat across from each other. Frank pushed the folder toward him. Go on. Alex opened it slowly, brows knitting as he skimmed the first page. Then the second. Then the third. He paused, his breath hitched. Is this, his voice dropped to a whisper, the cabin, the land, all of it? Frank nodded. Alex's eyes widened with disbelief. Grandpa, why me? The question wasn't entitled. It wasn't expectant. It was humble, almost scared. Frank rested his hands on the table, fingers interlaced. Because you showed up when others didn't. You didn't try to take anything from me. You didn't see this place as a prize waiting to be claimed. You saw it as home. Alex looked down, blinking rapidly, trying not to let emotion spill over. But I'm just a kid. You're a young man, Frank corrected gently. A good one. And this cabin, I want it to belong to someone who understands what it means. Someone who won't sell it, split it, or turn it into an investment property. Alex swallowed hard. I won't, I swear I won't. Frank leaned back slightly, watching the sincerity settle across his grandson's face. It wasn't excitement he saw, it was responsibility. Deep, almost solemn responsibility. Alex touched the paperwork again, fingertips tracing the lines like they were fragile. I'll preserve it forever, I promise. I'll take care of it, Jay. Us like you and Grandma did. Frank's chest tightened, not from sorrow anymore, but from something warmer, something like renewal. That's all I ever wanted. Alex looked up suddenly, eyes shining. Can we tell Dad? Not yet, Frank said softly. He needs time to understand himself before he understands this. Alex nodded, accepting that without argument. To break the heaviness, Frank stood and clapped his hands once. Now you hungry? Alex's expression brightened instantly. Always. Frank laughed, really laughed for the first time in what felt like months. He moved to the kitchen, pulling out the battered old pot that had belonged to Margaret, the one she used every winter. Alex joined him, chopping onions with exaggerated seriousness while Frank browned the meat and added spices. The smell of the chili rose slowly, filling the cabin with warmth, comfort, memory. They cooked the whole meal side by side. Frank guided Alex's hand when he added the chili powder, warning him not to sneeze. Alex joked about his culinary expertise, which earned him an amused shake of the head. When they finally sat down to eat, the steam curled between them like a bridge, one built not from blood alone, but from effort, loyalty, and genuine affection. This is the best batch yet, Alex declared through a mouthful. That's because you helped, Frank replied. Alex grinned, and for a moment the cabin felt like it used to, alive, loved, whole. After dinner, they washed dishes together. Not because they had to, but because neither seemed ready for the night to end. The wind outside rattled softly against the windows, but inside, everything felt warm and steady. Frank studied Alex as he dried a plate, noticing the calm confidence in his posture, the same steadiness Frank once saw in his own reflection when he first built the cabin. A new generation of Dawson men, reconnecting not out of duty, but out of choice. Grandpa, Alex said suddenly. Yes. I won't let you down. Frank placed a hand on his shoulder. I know, that's why you're the one I chose. And for the first time in a long while, Frank felt joy, not faint, not distant, but full and living, rising in him like a flame catching fire again. Tonight proved something he'd almost forgotten. Legacy isn't what you leave behind. Legacy is who you leave it to. The knock came late in the afternoon, gentle, nothing like the pounding confrontation earlier in the month. Frank looked up from the crossword puzzle in his lap, listening. That knock carried hesitation, not hostility. It carried the weight of someone unsure whether they'd be welcomed. Frank opened the door slowly. Charlie stood alone on the porch, shoulders hunched, eyes hollow with a different kind of exhaustion than before. No Rebecca beside him, no envelope, no demands, just a man stripped of every illusion he'd been clinging to. Dad, he said quietly, can we talk? Frank stepped aside without a word. Charlie entered, pausing inside as if absorbing the warmth of the cabin, warmth he hadn't let himself appreciate in years. He looked around, not with appraisal, not with entitlement, but with a kind of sad nostalgia. I didn't tell Rebecca I was coming, Charlie said. I just needed to do this on my own. Frank motioned toward the table. Charlie sat, resting his hands in front of him as if bracing for impact. For a long moment he couldn't meet his father's eyes. "Dad," he began, voice cracking immediately, "I messed up. I messed up badly." Frank sat across from him, steady, open, not forgiven but willing to hear him. Charlie exhaled shakily. "I lost myself somewhere along the way, between work expectations, trying to keep up with what everyone else had. I just kept chasing comfort, convenience, image, and I forgot what matters." He swallowed hard. "I forgot you." Frank didn't respond. He didn't need to. Charlie wasn't looking for reassurance. He was trying to unload the truth for the first time. "I thought the cabin was my future," Charlie continued. "Something guaranteed, something I could count on, and when it was, I panicked. I let Rebecca push me. I let her convince me that security was more important than family." He wiped his eyes roughly. "That's on me, not her, me." Frank's gaze softened. "Son." "No," Charlie cut in gently, holding up a hand. "Please let me say this." Tears brimmed but didn't fall. Not yet. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, as if the confession itself was too heavy to hold upright. "When we pushed for assisted living, I told myself we were helping you. I knew it wasn't true. I just didn't want to lose the future I thought I needed." His breath shook. "But I almost lost the father I actually needed." Now the tears came, quiet, messy, unguarded. They rolled down his cheeks as he pressed both hands over his face, shoulders trembling. "I'm sorry, Dad," he whispered through broken breaths. "I'm sorry for the pressure, the manipulation, the disrespect. I didn't see what I was turning into until it as too late." Frank let the silence breathe. Then he placed a hand on Charlie's forearm, steady, warm, without judgment. "I'm not angry," Frank said softly. "I was hurt, deeply, but not angry." Charlie cried harder at that, because forgiveness wasn't something he'd expected, not after everything. "I almost destroyed our family," Charlie choked out. "I almost destroyed you." Frank shook his head gently. "You didn't destroy me, you just lost your way. And rebuilding," he squeezed his son's arm, "rebuilding takes time, but it's not impossible." Charlie looked up, eyes red, face raw. "I want to fix this. I don't even know where to start." "You start," Frank said, "by remembering who you were before life made you afraid, and by being honest with yourself, and with me." Charlie nodded, wiping his face with the back of his sleeve. "I miss Mom. I think about what she'd say if she saw all this, and I know she wouldn't be proud." Frank looked toward the fireplace, the flames dancing low. "Your mother loved you more than anything, but she also expected you to be strong and kind. Both, not one at the expense of the other." Charlie swallowed, letting those words settle deep. "I want to be better, I will be." Frank rose and walked to the stove. "Coffee." Charlie let out a trembling laugh, the first he'd managed in weeks. "Yeah, please." Frank poured 2 mugs and set one in front of him. They sat in silence as the steam curled between them, neither rushing the moment. The quiet wasn't awkward, it was healing. The kind of silence men share when words are too fragile to interrupt. Charlie wrapped his hands around the mug, grounding himself. "Thank you for letting me come here." Frank nodded. "You're still my son." Charlie's eyes glistened again, but he held himself together this time. Barely, but enough. Outside, snow began to fall again, coating the lake in slow, patient white. Inside, father and son sat at the table, not fully mended, not fully healed, but beginning. For the first time in a long while, the Dawson family had a chance to grow back the parts it had lost. No raised voices. No accusations. Just coffee. And the first fragile thread of reconnection stretching between them. The late afternoon light stretched long across the frozen lake when Frank heard furious footsteps crunching up the driveway, quick, sharp, unmistakably hostile. He set down the book he'd been reading and stood slowly. There was no knock this time, no hesitation, just the door handle rattling hard, followed by a loud, impatient bang. Frank opened the door. "Rebecca." Frank exhaled once, steadying himself, then pulled the door open. Rebecca stood on the porch, hair windblown, face flushed with anger, breath puffing out in fast bursts of cold vapor. She pushed past him without waiting for permission, stomping into the living room like she owned the place. "Where is it?" she demanded. Frank closed the door behind her, unfazed. "Where is what?" "The paperwork," she snapped. "The trust, the documents, whatever trick you pulled to cut us out, I want to see it." Frank folded his arms. "You don't have access to any of that." "I should," she shot back. "You owe us transparency, Frank. This cabin affects our future." "No," Frank said calmly. "It affects only mine and Alex's." Rebecca spun toward him, teeth clenched. "You can't do this. You can't just lock us out and pretend you're making rational decisions." Frank's eyes narrowed slightly. "I didn't pretend anything." Rebecca stepped closer, jabbing a finger toward him. "You're unstable, that's what this is. Emotional, erratic. If people knew how confused and forgetful you've been lately." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Confused? I passed the competency exam you forced on me." She faltered for half a second, but the fury came roaring back. "Doctors make mistakes, and I can still take this to court. I'll tell them you're deteriorating, that you're being manipulated by Alex, that you're making decisions that endanger your well-being." Frank didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Rebecca, you can threaten me all you want. It doesn't change the truth, or the law." Rebecca let out a harsh laugh. "Truth? You want the truth? You are a selfish old man clinging to a piece of wood and nostalgia. You don't need a cabin. We need this cabin. We deserve it." Frank felt the anger flicker, but it didn't take root. He had weathered worse storms than her tantrum. "What you deserve," he said slowly, "is what you earn, and you earned nothing here." Rebecca opened her mouth to retort, but another voice cut sharply through the air from the doorway. "Yes, he didn't." Rebecca turned. Melissa had walked in, cheeks red from the cold, eyes burning with something fierce and long overdue. "Dad owes you nothing," Melissa said. "Not trust, not inheritance, not property, not explanations." Rebecca scoffed. "Oh, please, you're only saying that because you got a pity crumb in the will." Melissa stepped forward. "A crumb is more than you deserved. You pressured Charlie. You tried to shove Dad into assisted living. You manipulated us into thinking this cabin was a burden. We followed you because we were tired, not because you were right." Rebecca's expression twisted. "I was trying to secure our future." "By destroying his," Melissa shot back. Rebecca's fists balled. "Stay out of this. This is between me and Frank." "No," Melissa said firmly. "This is between you and every line you crossed." The room fell silent, thick with confrontation. Rebecca looked around, searching for support, someone, anyone to stand with her. But there was none. And then from behind Melissa, Anna. Our pair of footsteps entered the doorway. "Charlie." He looked worn, drained, changed. The man who once barked orders or echoed Rebecca's demands now stood with a solemn heaviness. Rebecca rushed toward him. "Charlie, tell them he can't do this. Tell him we need that cabin." Charlie lifted a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "Rebecca, go home." She froze, confusion flickering across her face. "What?" "You heard me," he said, voice low but resolute. "This has gone too far." She stared at him, betrayal and disbelief swirling in her eyes. "You're taking his side." "I'm taking the right side," Charlie said. "Dad didn't do anything to us. We did this to ourselves. And you," his voice cracked, "you pushed me into treating him like a resource instead of a father." Rebecca stepped back as if slapped. "So you're choosing them over me." Charlie swallowed hard. "I'm choosing what's decent, and this," he gestured to her anger, "is." Silence then. Rebecca's face hardened into something icy and final. "Fine. Stay here with your saintly father and your self-righteous sister. See how far that gets you." She grabbed her purse, marched to the door, and threw one last venomous glance back at them. "You're all making a mistake." She walked out. This time no one followed her. Not Charlie, not Melissa, not even the echo of her threats. The door shut with a thud that felt like an ending. Frank let out a quiet breath. Charlie's hands trembled slightly. Melissa placed a reassuring palm on his back. For the first time in weeks, the cabin didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like the moment just after a storm, when the air is still settling, but the sky is finally beginning to clear. The snow had finally settled into a soft, steady blanket across the pines when Frank lit the lanterns on his porch. It was late January, too late for Christmas, too early for spring, but somehow the timing felt perfect. A second chance disguised as an ordinary evening. He smoothed the tablecloth he'd set earlier and checked the simmering pot on the stove. The cabin smelled like rosemary, garlic, and something warm enough to stitch families back together. He glanced at the clock just as headlights appeared on the winding road. Not frantic headlights, not angry ones. Calm, deliberate. First Melissa's car, then Charlie's right behind it. Alex hopped out before either adult could unbuckle, bounding through the snow like a kid half his age. "Grandpa, we're here." Frank opened the door, smiling as the cold air rushed in with him. "Come on in, all of you. Dinner's almost ready." Melissa stepped inside carrying a pie, her cheeks pink from the cold, her smile shy but sincere. "Made this myself," she said. "No store shortcuts this time." Behind her, Charlie walked in more slowly. His posture was humbled, quieter, but not defeated. Just a man trying to rebuild something fragile and worth the effort. The cabin warmed instantly with their presence. Coats hung on the hooks. Snow melted onto the floor. Voices twined together like old memories knitting themselves back into place. In the kitchen, they cooked together. Nothing fancy, just roasted chicken, potatoes, vegetables. But the simplicity was the point. Melissa chopped carrots while Alex kept stealing them from the cutting board. Charlie mashed potatoes with such dramatic exaggeration that Alex nearly doubled over laughing. Even Frank laughed, really laughed, as he stirred the gravy, the kind of laugh that made his ribs feel less tight. It wasn't the loud, bustling Christmas gatherings of years past. It wasn't perfect. It was better, honest, intentional, all the noise replaced with sincerity. When dinner was ready, they gathered at the table. Frank bowed his head briefly before eating, not a prayer but gratitude. Quiet, private gratitude for the healing taking root across from him. Conversation slipped into easy rhythms. Melissa told stories from work. Alex talked about helping decorate the community center. Charlie chimed in with a sheepish admission that he burned toast that morning trying to multitask. Frank watched them, absorbing every smile, every softened expression, every tiny sign that the fracture was slowly knitting back together. After dinner, when plates were cleared and the cabin had settled into that post-meal glow, Frank stood, cleared his throat, and walked to a small wooden chest near the fireplace. "I have something for you," he said, looking at Alex. Alex blinked. "For me." Frank nodded and opened the chest. Inside sat an old, worn toolbox, oak, hand-built, edges smoothed from decades of use. The initials FD were carved into the lid, faded but still proud. Frank lifted it carefully. "Your grandmother bought me this when we first built the cabin. I've carried it my whole life. Every beam in this place, every repair, every project, I used these tools." He said it in front of Alex. Alex's breath caught. "Grandpa, this is yours." "It was mine," Frank corrected gently. "Now it's yours." Alex R. And his fingers over the lid, reverent, overwhelmed. "I'll take care of it. I'll take care of the cabin too. I promise." "I know you will," Frank said softly. Something shifted in the room then, like a knot loosening in the chest of everyone present. Charlie cleared his throat, his expression tightening with emotion he tried to steady. "Dad, I brought something too." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. Not a certified letter, not a demand. A handwritten apology. Charlie handed it to him with both hands, head lowered. I know I said a lot already, but I needed to put it in writing. I needed you to have proof I mean every word." Frank took it, fingers trembling slightly around the edges. He didn't open it yet. He didn't need to. The gesture alone was enough to warm him from the inside out. Melissa stepped closer. "Dad, I know we said it before, but next Christmas, we're going to make it special, really special, at your cabin with your traditions. No more fancy themes, no more switching houses. We want to come home." Frank's throat tightened. He nodded, unable to say more without giving away the full depth of how much it meant. Later, he settled into his armchair by the fireplace, the fire popping gently beside him. Alex sat on the rug examining the tools, admiring each one. Melissa flipped through an old family photo album on the couch. Charlie stood quietly by the window, staring out at the snowfall with a softness in his eyes Frank hadn't seen since he was a boy. Frank breathed in deeply, warmth, wood smoke, family. The cabin felt full again, not crowded, not chaotic, full. Complete. And as he watched the people who had once drifted away now settle back into their rightful places, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Home. A real family, rebuilt without Rebecca's shadow. And the night wasn't over yet. Not the healing. Not the story. Not the final choice still waiting just ahead. The night settled slowly over the frozen lake, the kind of stillness that felt almost sacred. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting warm amber light across the wooden floors and the old handmade furniture. Frank eased into his armchair, the one he'd sat in for decades, through Christmas mornings, quiet winters, and long stretches of solitude. But tonight, the silence felt different. It felt earned. He looked out the window at the snowy landscape, the pines standing tall under the weight of fresh powder. The cabin, his cabin, seemed to breathe with him. The walls held history, yes, but now they held something more: protection, purpose, future. Alex walked softly into the room, cradling the old toolbox Frank had given him earlier. He held it like something precious, something alive. He hesitated near the chair, clearing his throat gently. "Grandpa." Frank turned his head, smiling at the boy who had somehow become the bridge between old wounds and new beginnings. "Yes, Alex." Alex swallowed, eyes flickering toward the window before returning to his grandfather. "Do you ever regret it, cutting them out?" The question wasn't accusatory. It was vulnerable, honest, the way only a 16-year-old with a good heart could ask. Frank studied him for a moment. The fire's soft glow reflected in Alex's eyes, steady and warm. Then Frank let out a long, quiet breath. "No," he said gently, "I protected what mattered." Alex nodded, but he stayed standing, almost as if afraid to disturb the delicate peace of the night. Frank motioned for him to sit, and Alex sank onto the rug near the fireplace, toolbox resting beside him. He ran his fingers along the carved initials again, absorbing the weight of the legacy placed in his hands. A moment later, footsteps approached from the hallway. Charlie entered slowly, cautious, as if still learning how to move in this rebuilt version of his family. He carried 2 mugs of coffee, one of which he offered to Frank without a word. Frank accepted it. Charlie sat on the edge of the couch, close enough to be present but far enough to show respect. Humility had reshaped him, softened him. No more entitlement, no more assumptions, just a man trying, truly trying to be worthy again. "Dad," Charlie began quietly, "I've been thinking a lot about everything, about Mom, about Christmas, about how far I let things get." He shook his head, eyes lowering. "I'm grateful you didn't shut us out completely. I would have deserved it." Frank studied him, the slope of his shoulders, the sincerity in his voice, the humility that had been absent for far too long. "You made mistakes," Frank said, "but you came back. That matters." Charlie's eyes glistened. "Thank you for giving me the chance." Alex looked between them, sensing the fragile healing weaving through the room. Frank rested a hand lightly on the armrest, absorbing the moment as if memorizing the feel of it. He had wanted this, real family, not the hollow version that had shown up out of obligation. Charles, I took a slow sip of his coffee. You did what you had to do with the cabin. I understand that now. I don't, I don't feel entitled to it anymore. Frank nodded, his gaze steady. Good, because the cabin needs someone who sees it as more than an asset. He glanced at Alex, whose eyes widened slightly, not with pride, but with the weight of responsibility again settling on him. Still, he didn't shy away from it. Grandpa, Alex said softly, I'll take care of it always. Frank smiled. I know you will. The three of them sat in a triangle of firelight. The past, the present, and the future of their family, quiet, connected, rebuilt. Outside, the wind brushed the cabin just as it had for decades, but this time it felt less like weather and more like acknowledgement. Frank leaned back in his armchair, breath steady, gaze drifting once more to the snowy world framed by the window. Christmas lights still hung along the porch, faint but glowing. A little late for the season, perhaps, but perfectly timed for the healing that had followed. And as he sat there, he reflected, not with bitterness but with clarity. They canceled Christmas, he said quietly. Charlie and Alex looked up, but what they really canceled was their entitlement. Charlie bowed his head, understanding fully now. Frank continued, his voice calm, not sharp, carrying the truth with the gentleness of a man who had finally laid down a long burden. They wanted my house. His gaze softened as he looked at Alex and then at his son. I wanted my family. The fire crackled, filling the space between them. Frank's final words settled into the room like a closing chapter, firm and undeniable. In the end, only one of us got what we were waiting for. And for the first time in a long while, Frank felt whole.